thank you to everyone who is joining us by Zoom and by Facebook live stream. My name is Emily Hiemstra, and I am honored to be back as your moderator for this panel entitled Soundscapes and More, featuring three remarkable composers. We have Carol Ann Weaver, Hildegard Westerkamp, and Tina Pearson joining us tonight. This is going to be about an hour long. We'll try and keep it tight and on schedule. If you have any questions, please filter them through the chat. Diane Barry, who is one of the main organizers and visionaries behind this panel, will be filtering them. And we've left time at the end of the discussion to answer any questions that you might have. So please don't be shy, don't hesitate, write them in the chat and Diane will filter them. Now, before I introduce our panelists or give them room to introduce themselves, Diane just has a few words as well.
Emily tends to say it all and it's so wonderful. I add my thanks as well. This is our second panel in celebration of our 40th anniversary, and it's been doing the playlist. It's been fabulous, and I'm really looking forward to sitting back and hearing from these wonderful women and inspiring women, and keep an eye on the chat as well. And I don't, Emily, did you do the reminder for everybody to mute? So I will mute now and hand things back to Emily. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, that was just a quick reminder. If you're on Zoom with us, if you can mute your video and audio as well, just as we are recording this, to be available after this live broadcast this evening. To start off, one of our first questions, which I think is really important on a panel like this, that encompasses composers from such diverse backgrounds and artistic expressions. So our first question to our panelists, and I'm going to ask Hildegard to start us off, is if each of our panelists could tell us how they would describe their music. So Hildegard, if you could start us off, that would be wonderful this evening.
So it's unmuted now, you can hear me. Hello, everyone. And thank you for arranging this panel with my lovely friends and colleagues, Tina and Carol. I just wanted to say that I'm speaking from the west coast of Canada, from the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples here in Vancouver, the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I'm really, really grateful, as I mentioned earlier when we were chatting, is that I have been living here. It's such a beautiful place. And having come from Germany, I've ever been grateful to be on this land. And I want to mention it too, because I think it was because I came here that I became what I am, I guess a composer, or sometimes I like to say a writer of sound. I really have a sort of a specialty as a composer. I work almost exclusively with environmental sounds. My background was in classical music. Yes, I was a music student at the university, and I grew up with hearing classical music all the time. So I kind of internalized the structures of Western classical music and European classical music. And, but, you know, I was not a very, let's say, successful music student. I think I fled the classical music education as soon as I realized that I was allowed to listen to the whole world, to the soundscape. When I heard Murray Schafer lecture years ago in 71 or so at UBC here, University of British Columbia, it was like a sort of such a major ear opener, and I felt so much at home among people who were listening to sounds all the time on a daily basis, and where listening to environmental sounds, sounds that were part of our lives, became a real passion of mine, because it was associated with listening to society, listening to the environment, listening to what we were doing to the sound world. And I became quite an activist in noise, and the compositional aspects of my work kind of emerged out of all of that. I had never studied composition, and I think the combination of this sort of internalized classical structures and the much learning that I received from working with the World Soundscape Project, that combination, and then learning to field record, doing radio with Vancouver Cooperative Radio, all those things came together in the 70s for me. And those combinations then brought me into the sound studio, and I began to work with sound, experiment with sound. And I, was called a composer before I realized I was one. And that was a sort of an interesting progression, because I hadn't really ever considered that I would be an artist in my life. That was just not part of my reality. And when I realized I was just delighting in bringing together sounds in the studio, and when I realized how important that was to me, that kind of listening, then it kind of dawned on me that, yeah, okay, I am composing with sounds, and in fact was doing something quite new, because it was something that we had sort of experimented with in the World Soundscape Project, but I hadn't really been exposed to anyone who worked like that. Later on, I found out that Luc Ferrari in France was doing that the people, Musique Concrète, Pierre Schaeffer, were working with environmental sounds, but they were not necessarily wanting to make that connection to a kind of activism in the ecological sense with the soundscape. And so I was passionate about the messages that came from working with environmental sound, talking about the issues of soundscape, talking about noise pollution, talking about listening, pointing out listening. And people like Merce Schaefer, John Cage, Pauline Oliveros had high influence on my work in that regard. And kind of, I think gave me some foundation in the belief of what I was doing was a good direction. And so I just went and did it. And eventually it was called soundscape composition. This is now apparently a genre. And nowadays people are, very much involved in working with environmental sound. So I was just so interested in the richness and the complexity that environmental sounds gave me. And working with that richness in the studio kind of presented me with all sorts of wonderful surprises. When I learned to do some processing in the studio, I, initially could not believe what was happening when I had, for instance, a whispered voice and the many overlays and processing things. Suddenly it sounded like a little bit like liquid, like water. And I was so stunned by that, what played back to me over the speakers, that, often I just didn't know what to do with it. It was such a new experience. And frankly, I had never or found it very difficult to think about composing for instruments, because it was almost too abstract. I needed that language that the environmental sounds gave me to speak along with my own ideas about the soundscape. And I was very purposely concrete about that. Abstract composition was not a source of inspiration for me, even though I loved listening to it.
That's so wonderful, Hildegard. I'm so sorry to cut you off, but I would love to hear more about your work with technology in just a few minutes. I'd like to pass things over to Tina Pearson. Can you tell us, Tina, how you would describe your music?
Okay, that's a big question for everybody, I think. What do you say? Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel with the amazing Hildy and Carol. I'm really quite honored to be in a trio with the two of them. I really admire both of them and their work. I'm here in Victoria, which is the territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. And I've been here for about 15 years. I'm from originally, I'm a first generation Canadian. I was born and raised in the territory of the Nigagooza-Minnekining and Couchiching First Nations, which is in northwestern Ontario. And my parents, I mention this because I think our backgrounds, as I age, I notice that our backgrounds and ancestries really play a role in how we work. And my mom is from what used to be Belarus and is now Belarus, used to be Poland, and my father's from northern Scandinavia. And I grew up in a very wilderness area where there were no concerts, there wasn't a lot of culture. It was a small kind of pulp town, and my family had businesses in the wilderness. So my exposure to sound worlds really was that kind of sound world, with the water, the ice, walking on the ice in the winter, these really vast, desolate expanses of sound. You know, the rich, which we don't have anymore. It's really quite different now, but the richness of the fauna in that environment at night and during the day was really a profound influence on my life, not just on my music. You know, so I would cricket sounds, frog sounds, all of that, and being close to water. I moved to Toronto to go to school, and was fortunate, I'd say, in I went to the conservatory actually for a while, and realized after a year of studying there quite intensively that that was not my place. And I went to York University, which there was a period of time when there were many people coming in from the States. So there was Jim Tenney, David Rosenboom, Phil Warren, Trishi Shankran, and John Higgins, so the South Indian music. And the way that they taught music there they didn't define music as Western European music. That Western European music was just one part, which it is, of a global way of working with sound, and thinking about one's different cultures' relationships with sound, ways people use music and sound making for healing, for rituals, for celebrations. So it was really quite wonderful for me and really refreshing to have that experience. And at the same time, I took a physics of sound course, and was really quite fascinated with the harmonic series in particular. See, for my music now, I would say that if I use the word composer, I would say that I'm really interested in composing experiences, composing situations, places, opportunities for myself, and for the people I work with, and for witnesses or audiences or participants to slow down and figure out what their relationship with sound is, or what this sound is there. So it's not so much, although I do produce pieces and music, it's not the focus of my music and my interest. I do a biospheric art practice regularly, and I work with a group here called the Experimental Music Unit. We have a regular improvisation practice. And I work a lot with facilitated composition when I'm asked or commissioned to do pieces for ensembles. I like to work with their environments, their relationship with their environments, their own ancestries, where they're from, and find a way to work through some different ideas, exercises, and pieces that incorporate listening, attention states, materials of the instruments to come up with kind of a facilitated, collaborative kind of piece, which I find really quite fascinating and more interesting than what I could come up with if I was composing in an isolated way for an ensemble. Is my time up?
No, that was lovely, Tina. Again, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about how you work with technology and what those collaborations look like. For right now, I'd love to turn it over to our third and final panelist, to Carol. Could you, Carol, tell us how you would describe your music?
First of all, thanks for allowing me to be here. I'm extremely honored to be with the two guests that have just spoken, and to be in your all's presence as well. My music is sort of taking new turns every time I seem to make music up, and I would not be able to put it into any one category, but I started with a very classical background. Trained to be a pianist, a concert pianist, went to Indiana University and had all that kind of experience, but secretly liked to compose, and then started studying composition and studied with John Eaton, Bernard Haydn, people like that, and wanted to write the big pieces, as we all did back then, the big orchestra pieces, the big choral pieces. So I did that too. But I ended up finding that to work with voice, human voice, is very important for me. And so I've been spending a lot of time over the years working with different singers, sometimes singer-songwriters. Are you hearing a jump rope outside? Is it distracting anybody? The kids outside? Raise your fingers if you do. Okay, thank you. They're part of why I love being here in this town. But anyhow, I've thought a whole lot about style, and at one point when I was living in Winnipeg, I remember looking up at a painting on the wall that I had a print, and I thought, you know, it doesn't matter what style I do, it will take care of itself as I go. So I don't worry about style at this point, but there was one time where I was just extremely worried about whether this was avant-garde, whether it was melodic, whether it was harmonic, or whether it was sort of soundscape-ish without being a soundscape. And gradually I found that that's the stupidest thing in the world to worry about. Just write what you need to at the time. My only rule of thumb is it's got to be something I really, really like. And that often means something I can sing or that rhythmically really captures my attention. So for all of this, I traveled to Africa many times. I go back there whenever I can to get the vibe there. There's something happening in that continent where I've visited, and I've let that get into my own bloodstream. Played music with the people there. Just was typing last night, Facebooking with one of the drummers I worked with. It's just it changes you. I've worked in ethnomusicology as well, and then sound. I've been recording sound since I heard about Hildegard Westerkamp and other people like Wendell and Bartley, who were recording everything. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll go and get me a little Sony recorder and the Sony Pro and start that way. So I've been recording nature sounds all over Africa where I've been, here in Canada. Only people if they give me permission, and that opens up lots of things of what we can use of people's contributions. But let me just say that I love listening, I love hearing, and in a sense, when John Cage came to Indiana and I asked him the question, what's your favorite music? And I like his answer. He says, actually, my favorite music is no music at all. And now I sort of think I understand what that means. You're listening to the world around you. So
That's really beautiful, Carol. I love that. I hope that as I get older, that's something I can unpack too, that quote from John Cage. So now I'd love to move into what I consider my favorite part of this panel, talking about technology. For those of you who are tuned in either on Zoom or on Facebook, perhaps you can relate. I have always found working with technology intimidating and not sure where to start, and which is why I find these three panelists so exciting and admire them so much, because they have been forging new paths in this area. So I know this is a question Diane and I share as well, but we'd love to hear from our panelists, starting with Carol, how you use technology, what your approach has been. This is maybe 5 questions, so I do apologize, giving you 5 minutes to answer 5 questions. Talking about how you use technology and maybe how your approach has changed over time. And what is your approach to writing electroacoustic music, say maybe over and against traditional notated music?
Well, thank
So
you.
Carol, please take that large question away.
Well, you'd think I'd be writing really austere music, because one of my first experiences with that was spending an evening with Robert Moog when he was designing the Mini Moog, and I was invited to help design that with my composition teacher, and I also then wrote electronic pieces, and Milton Babbitt happened to be in our audience once. So you'd think that that would lead me to where I wanted to go. But I found that early experience with the abstract, I don't know, I don't want to drop any names lest one of you just loves that guy to death, but one of the traditional electronic musicians of the early 20th century, the mid 20th century, it was fascinating, but it sort of like left me cold. So I did my versions of that electronic music with whatever synthesizers I had at the time. Mini Moog was one of them. The Putney. Has anybody heard of the Putney? Aha. Oh yeah, really? All right, we're friends. That little baby that you put pins in a board was one of the versions that I worked with, and wrote these swimmy pieces called Beyond Soundless Stars, with, you know, atmospheric piano coming in, and you can just imagine, you can hear the piece. You've all heard it now. Yes, that's what it was then. It was fun, but you know, then I got into real music and tried to keep a real beat with a real singer-songwriter and a real rock band and a real jazz band. And somehow that sort of changed it. So I went through that, and I didn't really do much with electronic music, except that I bought my little raft of synthesizers, again with Wendell and Bartley helping me decide what to do. The DX7, the DX11, and the CP35 was a keyboard, but I used it as much like a synthesizer, trying to get these really wonky, far out sounds. But my big interest has always been performance. And so if I couldn't perform it, well, what good was it, sort of? That was what I was thinking. So I tried to perform these. I'd get commissioned to write pieces for other people, send them my electronic spectrums, and they'd play my pieces on their DX7 without the E attachment. And it sounded like just, you didn't want to hear it, because it missed that extra thing. So to get someone else to do my electronic music, it wasn't working. So then, I don't know, then at that point, I sort of, I haven't delved in it, and frankly, the synthesizers are just, I use them for MIDI to write my pieces. Then I became loving all over again of live performance and acoustic instruments. So that's sort of a little bit of a roundabout, but in the meantime, why maybe this conversation interests me so much is that I got extremely interested in putting sounds together as in a soundscape, bringing sounds from a city in Paraguay, or a forest in Algonquin, or that kind of thing, and trying to ferret through them. And I've admired just like crazy all the filters that you can do, Hildegard, and wish that I would indulge in all that equipment. But I use very basic equipment just so that I can get the soundscape and the combinations of sound, and try to make it in kind of symphony in its own kind of way. Again, inspired by so much of what you do, Hildegard. Every soundscape you do to me is a beautiful symphony, as it were. So I've shaped, the last I did was just last week. I did something called Birds in My Backyard, and I had 6 different birds I was representing and shaping them and letting them sort of dialogue with each other. It was just way too much fun. And to think that that's seriously a soundscape, that that blows me away. So I've used these kinds of soundscapes on their own, presented online, and also as part of a piece where I brought in performers to play with me, or to play with that as a sound background. So that's just a bit. I'll stop there.
No, that's great, Carol. I really appreciate hearing your journey as well. And I hadn't realized that you had worked in electroacoustic music as well. So that's really, really encouraging and wonderful to hear your story and your journey with that. Hildegard, we'd love to turn things over to you. Again, I apologize, this is such a big question for so little time, but if you could share with us how you use technology and how your approach has changed over time, and maybe also, if there's time, what your approach is to writing a soundscape piece.
Sure, thank you. Carol reminded me of something that I'd completely forgotten. When I was studying at UBC, there were these regular electronic music concerts on Monday noon hour. And I used to go in there, and I used to try to listen to everything I could hear. And you know, I'd never really heard electronic music, and I was completely mystified. And I thought, in order to find any access to this, I was kind of interested in it, but I just didn't know what to do with it. And I thought, I've got to learn how to do this in order to understand what electronic music is. And Barry Truax at the time was a master's student at UBC, and he gave a six-week summer course at UBC, and I decided to take that. And you know, I'm glad I did it, but I tell you, I had such a hard time with the technology. I just didn't even understand the whole concept of output and input when you had to, you know, put cables into things and out of things, and I just didn't understand it. And it took me years to finally get it. So that was my beginning with technology. I've always had a love-hate relationship to technology. I've depended on it. I needed microphones. I needed a studio to work with what I'd recorded. And the recorders that I went through since the 80s, cassette recorder, Nagra in the World Soundscape Project, the cassette recorder, DAT recorder, whatnot, and now the, you know, the hard disk recorders, and microphones were my friends, because they gave me the materials for what I was going to do in the studio. The entrance into the studio, initially in the World Soundscape Project, we had the Sonic Research Studio, and it was kind of set up as a classic European analog electronic studio. But we had a lot of tape recorders of really good qualities, and we had a lot of you know, equipment like filters and equalizers and things like that. And so I was lucky to be in that environment, and I was lucky that that studio was available just to the group and not to any students. So I actually had hours and hours in the studio, and really, you know, was just finding my way. I had no idea what I was doing. Barry showed me a few things. Barry was also later my colleague in the World Soundscape Project. He showed me some of the techniques, the analog studio techniques, and off I went. You know, I want to just demystify this. I have not used a lot of intricate processing equipment, other than, you know, slowing sounds down, speeding them up, pitch shifting it's called now, filtering, equalizing, reverb, yeah, a few other more complicated things. But really, the kinds of processing that I received from this equipment was already so delightful and gave me so many more inroads in working with environmental sounds that I had quite enough. And I found it very difficult when and of course it was a totally male-dominated environment, the electroacoustic environment. Colleagues of mine would come into the studio, and sometimes I would ask them, I'm trying to get this sound, can you show me how to do it? And then they would do that, and then they would want to show me a whole bunch of other techniques. And, you know, I just could not take it in. And I would just have to throw them out of the studio. I said, sorry, thank you for giving me what I need right now, but I cannot take in any more right now. So I was never somebody who could who would pursue technology in that way. I love the tool that it gave me, the tools that it gave me, and it allowed me to work the way I wanted. My real fascination was what the technology revealed to any given environmental sound that I would use in the studio. And that's where the big change came. And I mean, I've never really used that many different techniques all my life. And the approach technologically changed with the technologies that are now available, but basically not profoundly in terms of discovering new avenues or so. The change is in whatever soundscapes I work in, they give me different materials, and those materials create a unique type of soundscape, even if I use the same techniques on those sounds. But so that's basically, yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you, Hildegard. That was yeah, really, really interesting, and just to hear your approach and that they're yeah, it's encouraging at the same time that even though it might seem overwhelming, that it's so that you found the tools that you needed to make it work, and that you, yeah, that was really, really encouraging. So I'd love to turn things over to Tina. Tina, again, this large question, I do apologize. How do you use technology, and how has your approach changed over time? And if time, how would you describe your approach to writing a piece of music?
Yeah, it's a big question. You know, at the age that I'm at, my relationship with technology has, of course, changed quite a lot. There were no computers, of course, when I was younger, and when I started working with sound and music. I did have an early tape recorder, and I used that to just record around where I was. But when I was in school and then started, I did a lot of work composing for modern dance, but I used just a basic cassette deck to record ideas and then play them back, and then record over them and play them back. You know, that real basic kind of, okay, how does this sound together? You know, and then that went on to, you know, a number of us who were working out of the music gallery worked with 8-track tapes and you know, kind of recording pieces and using them in performances like that. So there was that early kind of use of tape and tape loops, and you know, making the long in the space, making a big kind of loop of things. So it was quite interesting, I found, because it was visceral, it was tactile. You were working with actual material. But the first, so it wasn't, I wasn't specifically using technology. It was more of a tool, you know, to do that. And I think that the first piece, it was when computers were starting to be used. And was it the Atari computer? Is that right? That first, Carol and Hildy, I think it was. I had for quite a while been really interested in the structure of the harmonic series, and I had made a number of different kind of scores stretching out the harmonic series in time to use the numbers for organizing time as well. So Hildy and I actually were part of this residency with Pauline Oliveros at SFU. I think it was in 1989. And the Kenneth Newby, a wonderful composer, and Matt Rogalski, a wonderful sound artist, helped me to use 8 FB01 oscillators to create this computer program with the Atari to have, I think it was 100 and some harmonics, and then I could vary the length of time, the number of harmonics, if it was sine tones, the space, the duration, the volume of them. So that kind of set me up for a long time with working with that material. And since then, I've continued to work with the harmonic series and with sine tones, and on the other part, I've continued to work with recording. And I think for me, my complete focus with the technology in those two is to try to find out what's going on inside of things. You know, so with the sine tones, the piece that I gave for the playlist for this month, is kind of exploring a just and tone minor third, like on a microscopic scale with using sine tones. And then at the same time, I like to use hydrophones and contact mics to kind of record underwater, to, to find the sounds that I can't hear with my ears. Same with the sign, with the exploring the inside of a sound, for example. I can't really hear that with my ears, but I can spread that apart and look at it and figure out what that is. And I find that really fascinating. And same with the hydrophones, or I use glass vessels and put contact mics on them and then slow that down to hear what's the inside of that sound. So for me, the technology is more of a fascination with what can I find that I can't hear otherwise with it. So that's the first thing, I guess. And the other part is using technology a lot in how I'm working a lot more with video, with performances, using video and audio pieces. I've done more installations rather than performance pieces the last few years, working with sounds above and below and at the edge boundaries of the frequency range of human hearing. Just to explore that whole area. And I also work with telematic music, which is music that you do in platforms that are where you're not in the same room, so like here or in Skype. And I've been working since 2007 with the Avatar Orchestra Metaverse, which is a global media art collective. And we create performance pieces and installations in virtual worlds in ways where you couldn't do them in real life. And so that's been quite a fascinating journey, kind of, again, looking inside of these network spaces, like what is cyberspace? How are we, rather than using it as a venue or a way to connect, actually looking at it as a space, and what is it? What is it built of? How do we interact in here? So it's been, it's definitely, technology has definitely become more of part of my world these days. At the same time, I try to balance that with doing things that are completely not related at all to a computer or a tape recorder.
No, I thank you for sharing, Tina. That's really fascinating to hear how yourself and Hildegard and Carol, you all have these wonderful different approaches to using technology, which is really fascinating. And I hope that all of you watching on Zoom and on Facebook Live or later on in the future, that these would be areas and avenues that you might like to explore. So moving on to our final question for this evening before we open it up to a period of questioning, to questions, I'd love to ask questions that are forward thinking into the future. So as each of you, our panelists, are working in slightly different areas in worlds of soundscapes, I would love to hear from you what you see the future of your musical field looking like. And at the same time, what advice you might have for either young composers who are looking to explore new areas and mediums, or for other composers that might be coming from a more traditional Western background who would love to expand their compositional variety and their output. Again, apologize for these large questions, but I hope that they open up a breadth of discussion. So I'd love to start this again, Tina, off with you tonight, if you could share with us what you see, your vision for the future of your field.
Sure. Well, I have no idea. We're really in shifting sands times right now. I think that it's pretty clear that we need to kind of pause and think about what we're doing a lot. I think my advice, I guess, would be related to that, is for anybody who's working in music and sound, is to first to really get in touch with and find and explore your own personal relationship with sound. It's just so important to know how sound resonates in you, in your body, how your breath and your voice and your fingers, work with the material you're using if you're playing an instrument. I think that's just a basic for me. And I think your ancestral relationship with sound. What are the stories of where you come from, how your people interacted with sound, music, listening, sound making? I think it's really important for us here in Canada to think about that in relation to reconciliation and land back, and really understanding that there are ways and stories about how to sound with the land here that we don't know about, and that we've been bringing in these ideas. And I think it's important to ask ourselves what our relationship is with that. And I think that with that in mind, I'll just end with saying I think it's important to consider the context in which we're working. Ask if the way you're working now, or your training, or the way you plan to work is in tune with your values and your beliefs. Are these contexts implicitly supporting ways of being or social, political structures that you might not believe in? So that's that.
Thank you, Tina. That was very insightful. Carol, would you mind sharing your thoughts for the future?
As I said before, the other people came on, there's this sentence, what is older than its mother? And nobody seemed to know, which I thought, oh, okay. They didn't spend their lives canning and preparing garden food, maybe like my people. But anyhow, what's older than its mother? Vinegar. It collects that rich little resonance in it, and it's called the mother of the vinegar. So I think of the young people as being the mother of us all right now. Us here in this panel maybe are the vinegar, not always so sweet, maybe very sweet sometimes. But I look to the young people who will, in a sense, mother us to where we need to go. And I have no doubt that your all's insights, those of you who are in a younger generation, are already thinking of things to go. If anyone had suggested to me when I was in my 20s, now, Carol, I think you should be going in this direction. Some people tried that, of course. Why don't you, I think if you would do this, your music might get more harmonic. It might get nicer, Thought, well, who are they? So I don't think I have any prescriptions, but I was just getting carried away with what Tina said about being in tune with your own self, as it were, with the sounds around you. Trying to be honest with what you hear and representing it. If I could put in one plug, I love to listen to CBC radio, but I don't have much patience for always popular music that they play in the talk show things. So how are we all listening to music so that those rare times when we hear something fascinating, that becomes what we really feature in our lives, culturally and across generations and across different groups of us. In ACWC, we're talking so much about inclusivity now, and we realize we've been just nothing much but a bunch of mostly European gals. And how do we reach out to those who don't come from the roots that we do? How do we listen? That's what I want to do. I've spent so much of my life listening to African people, and I'm so overwhelmed by what I've learned from them. So it's daunting to think I would have anything to pass on, but I guess I'm still a kid. I'm still in the mode of listening and trying to figure out what I can do when I grow up, as it were. And if anything that I've learned could inspire anybody else, well, it would be I don't know, they should look elsewhere, whatever. But it's important to know that I'm a child at heart, and I'd like to remain that. And hopefully our children will remain children at heart as well.
No, thank you for that, Carol. That's yeah, really wonderful to hear, for your honesty. And last but not least, Hildegard, would you mind closing us out, your insights into the future of Soundscapes and More?
Yes, I think the acknowledgement that we don't know what the future brings is really important. The fact that there's uncertainty, and more so and we're aware of that uncertainty that's there anyways. We're aware of that uncertainty more viscerally now. COVID has brought something about that actually makes me hopeful if we can only continue to listen and remember. The opportunity to not pursue a hectic lifestyle as it was the status quo, or whatever the status quo was of our lives before COVID, to not have to do that has made us all listen up. And not all of us had the luxury of time slowing down. For some professions, time has horribly sped up, and the medical profession is completely differently involved in this time. But even that change, I think any kind of change will make us listen up. And listening is, in fact, what children know the best. And if we can learn and observe how children listen, if we can remember that, then we can come closer to the fact that listening is, in fact, a deeply complex process. And it brings us in touch with the uncertainty of life. And if we learn to listen, it can actually give us a grounding towards that uncertainty, because we are then in touch with time passing. We are in touch with how life goes on every day. And that's been my experience over the years, having done many, many sound walks with people and discussions and learning from these experiences and exchanges that we've all had. Tina and I have had huge conversations about all this. The fact that we can never stop learning about listening is really the most important message here. And I think if we can teach each other, and if we can learn from children, and if we can learn from cultures that listen differently to the world, such as the indigenous cultures, we maybe finally can learn that we need to be living with the environment. We cannot live in opposition to the environment. I think there's a direct implication to climate change, to the environmental crisis that we are facing now. And we want to learn how to ground ourselves in this time where we need to make huge changes in order for, certainly for us to survive, and other species. The earth will survive, but we will not if we go on this way. And so all I can say really is that the immersion into learning, to being in touch with listening, is the big teacher here, certainly from my perspective, for anybody, whether we're young or old.
Well, thank you, Hildegard, for all your words of wisdom, and to Carol and Tina as well for joining us. This has been a remarkable and illuminating past hour. I want to open the floor before we wrap things up. If there's any questions. Diane, have you received any questions for our panelists?
There is one here. Question for Hildegard. Maybe it could be, got the wrong spot. Hildegard, how did she plan her approach to writing a multi-movement work like Into India? Was it similar to what more traditional composers would use when planning a large-scale work?
I always stumble over the word writing because that's not what I do. I don't sit in front of a piece of paper and write music. I create compositions from the sounds that I record. And the India works happened quite differently than from most of my other pieces. I was invited to do a soundscape workshop in New Delhi in 1992. And in that context, I brought my DAT recorder, and the workshop participants were incredibly interested in me recording everything that they showed me in Delhi. I mean, we basically went on many, many tours through Delhi. And because we didn't have much technology, but I had my recorder, they basically ordered me to record everything. So I got some really beautiful recordings of areas that I would not have otherwise probably found. I had an overwhelming amount of recordings after I came back from my first visit. And then there were other visits in the 90s where I recorded more. And it took me years to tackle these because I felt like I'm a visitor to this country. Who am I to work with these sounds? What do I have to say? And so I decided, well, I'm a visitor, so I'll speak as a visitor. And that's basically where those pieces came about. The first one that I did, I think it was the first one, is called Gently Penetrating Beneath the Sounding Surfaces of Another Place. It's a mouthful. But it's mostly about the vendors in New Delhi. I was delighted by all those voices, those very energetic voices that I heard in that soundscape. And so I created a piece around the soundscapes in which they were recorded. And that was sort of a portrait of that vendor life. And then there's another piece in India as a sort of labyrinth of the traveler. And the last one was about sacred matters, the sacred soundscapes of India. And that was the most complicated one in terms of who am I to talk about the sacred spaces of India. That was the biggest struggle. But yeah, it took years of digesting the visits, digesting the new culture, digesting what was my relationship to those recordings. And then I just went over the years into the studio, and that's what came out.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Hildegard. Diane, do we have any more questions before we wrap up?
Look, there was a few. Nope, there's no more questions.
Well, thank you so much, Hildegard and Tina and Carol, for giving us your time, lending us your time this evening. It's been a pleasure and an honor to speak with you. And I hope this has been illuminating for everyone on Zoom and Facebook Live, and those of you who will be watching this in the future. We have a couple of thank yous. First of all, I should say thank you to Diane for vision of this idea and creating more panels for the ACWC's 40th anniversary. So thank you. Thank you for including me as well. I feel incredibly honored. We have a huge thank you as well to Amanda Lowry, who has been doing all of the audio visual tech. Oh my goodness, such a monstrous thing. Thank you, Amanda, for working on all of that as well and making everything smooth and seamless. And thank you as well to our panelists for joining us. I don't think I've missed anyone in the thank yous. Please someone speak up if I have.
Thank you, Emily.
My pleasure. Thanks, Tina.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to all of you who have joined us for this evening. We wish you all the best. And please, if you have any questions, please email the ACWC, and we would love to get in touch with you or any of the composers as well, if you would like to learn more about them or their work. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks.